right, we're going to rock and roll because I probably have 2 hours of content. Because Foundations has a lot of questions. I know. I'm both excited and slightly concerned about the number of questions that came for this. So thanks for coming, everybody. We're calling this Presbyterianism 101, but a couple of disclaimers about it. The first being that in the next 5.5 weeks-ish, we're going to cover probably 3 semester-long classes worth of content. So this is like a big chunk of seminary, and we're going to have to stay very high level to get through it. But we have blocked an entire week at the end where Lucy and I, open forum, will just take questions. We may even, I may even have people submit them so we can make sure that anything that we need to brush up on or find from somewhere else ahead of time, we're ready to talk about. But basically, we're going to try to cover a lot of content quickly. So why this class? This actually came out of the Foundations class, and I don't know the total origins of it, except that people have questions, and not everybody grew up Presbyterian, and even if you did, you don't always remember or maybe never learned some of the stuff that is distinctive and interesting, or even maybe a little weird about our denomination, our branch of Christianity. So Bonnie, the fearless leader of the Foundations class, reached out to Lucy and me and said, you know what, our class has questions. And I said, okay, what kind of questions? And she said, why don't we read Revelation more? And yeah. No, we do not ignore it. We do not ignore it. But to your point, it is not prevalent in our worship life. It is not prevalent in the lectionary. So it is not a scripture that gets as much public attention as some others for some good reasons. It is it's part of a body of literature in our Bible called the apocalyptic literature. It is not obvious. You don't sit down and read Revelation and go, oh, got it. It takes some work to understand it and the symbolism involved in it, but we do not ignore it. So that's one of the things we're going to get to. Some of the other reasons to do this class are just to feel more rooted. And most of us, I think everyone in this room has kids. They're a huge range of ages, but we want to be able to talk to them about stuff, right? I said to my kids yesterday that Aisha was coming to preach, and they know Aisha a little bit. And I said, you know, Aisha works for the presbytery. And my child said, what's the presbytery? And I said, oh, I have failed. I got to talk to you about how we work as Presbyterians. Now, in fairness, that's the kid who hasn't been through confirmation yet. So maybe she's going to get some of that. But that's how this class started. And we're recording. I think, Lucy, are we recording? Okay, so if anybody you know misses one, and Bonnie's going to have a mic for questions, we'll come back to them. That's why this class. I'm going to just overview where we're going for the next few weeks, and then we're going to jump into some of our history. So today, how did we get here? Bonnie wrote me and said, everybody loves an origin story. I said, okay, we'll do the Presbyterian origin story, which is not the most glamorous of origin stories. This is not like a true Hollywood story or behind the music, but we do have one. We're going to do some of that today at warp speed. Next week, we're going to dig into what we believe. In particular, there were questions about what's distinctive about what we believe and what we do and how we are governed from other denominations. So quick survey, and there are no wrong answers here, and there's no shame here. Who in the room grew up Presbyterian? Of those, PCUSA? All yes? Any other Presbyterian denominations? Loosely? Okay. Who grew up Methodist? Oh, that's interesting. Got all the way in the other side. All right. Thanks, Methodists. We do love you. Who grew up Baptist? I thought that's surprising because there are a lot of former Baptists in this congregation. Episcopalians? Handful. Proud, Eleanor. Get that hand all the way up. We love Episcopalians. Any other Protestant denominations? Oh, now you're a complicated case. Which one are you going to identify with? Disciples of Christ. Thank you, Bill Jordan. Anybody grow up non-Christian? You grew up in the Jewish community. Yes, I'm so glad. I can't wait to talk to you about that more. And maybe some of that will come out in this class as well. Karen, Unitarian. Thank you. I forgot about our UU friends. Anybody else? Dom. Okay, now that's an interesting mix. So the Wesleyan tradition, we're going to see a little bit of Catholic tradition. I thought we'd have some other Catholics. Any other former? Yeah, okay. There we go. I forgot to ask. Oh, Shirley in the back. Lots of former, maybe still a little bit somewhere in you, Roman Catholics. And that's okay. We trace back to the same roots with a split. So next week, we're going to dig into what we believe, in particular, what we mean by Reformed theology, which is different from the Roman Catholic tradition. And some of the specific questions we got, and we'll do our best to cover this in the amount of time we have, are about election, which is the sort of theological doctrine that we use to understand salvation. Predestination, always a crowd pleaser. Or maybe a fear. Are y'all all worried about predestination? Jim is. Thank you for your honesty, Jim. Yes, I am worried about it.
We're only worried if we're predestined for the wrong place.
Jim, am I in the 144,000? Yeah. We're going to demystify predestination and talk about what we really do hold to and what we don't, right? Because this is one of those things that has become kind of outsized importance for the Presbyterian tradition. Everyone thinks this is really our big thing. Really our big thing? If we had to name one, what would y'all say our big thing is? Grace. Thank you. Grace. That's a good Presbyterian right there. Grace is our thing, not predestination. But we're going to talk about what it means. Covenant, what it means to be a covenant people and living in covenant community. Grace, sin, and salvation. The foundations class did want to know about hell, which was interesting. Hell and Revelation. I worry about what y'all are doing on Sunday mornings.
Yeah, this is all through a Baptist lens. No, actually, a lot of these questions came after Easter.
Yep.
And Jesus did some traveling, maybe to hell, and came back. And we had a lot of questions about, where Jesus was and all this time. And so hell came up a good bit in the spring.
Okay, hell. We're going to cover hell-ish. And the Trinity, what we believe about the Trinity, that predates the name of this congregation, of course. We are named after something else. We cannot cover our entire doctrinal belief system in 40 minutes. So we're going to take 2 weeks because 80 minutes is enough. Just kidding. But in our second class on this, on the 8th, we're going to talk about our creeds and confessions. So when we say an affirmation of faith together in worship, where did those come from? And do we really believe all of those? And what do they mean? We won't work through all of them, but we'll kind of cover some of the high points. And then this January, we're going to have a whole adult ed series on the creeds and confessions. Sort of how did these come about? What's the point of them? What do we still think about the ones that are quite old at this point? One of those classes is going to be led by Martha Moore Kish, who's a systematic theology professor at Columbia Seminary and has been tapped to be on a committee of people who have been asked to write a new creed, a new confession for the Presbyterian Church. So, church nerds rejoice. History happening in our time. We're going to get a new confession. So how do we understand those old or more recent statements of faith? What authority does the Bible have for us now? How is our canon formed? This is one we get a lot. Why are the books that are in there? And what do we think about them? How is it translated? That is a big one because what you're reading is not original, right? So every single time we read the Bible, no matter what English version we're using, someone has made really important translation decisions. They've taken a word and said, I think we're going to use this option for this word. And someone else says, of this range of 7 things this word could mean, I think it's this one. And before you know what's happened, if you're just reading in English, your interpretation has been shaped by someone else's translation decision. And we're going to talk about the apocalyptic literature for Bonnie, writings like Revelation. Then on the 15th, we're going to talk about what we do. So our order of service, if you haven't noticed, it is very intentional. It has a very particular flow within the service from gathering. We confess very early. Oh, wait, don't teach this one now, Rebekah. We're going to do what we're going to do during worship on the 15th, the order of worship. Our sacraments, everyone knows how many sacraments we have in the PCUSA? 2. All God's people say 2. And they're up there. Yeah, there you go. What do we understand about evangelism? This was a question that came from Foundations, and I was so glad for that question because evangelism has kind of taken on connotations that weren't original in our culture today and may actually be a barrier to our practicing the original intent of the word evangelism. Euangelion, the Greek word, just means, you might know, good news. Good news. So when you hear something in the political news about evangelicals, that has some connotations that have nothing at all to do with what biblical good news means. So let's unpack that together. Service of others. Then how we work. A week about Presbyterian polity and church governance, including ordination and authority within our congregations. This is obviously a place where we differ pretty significantly from a lot of other Christian denominations. So there are distinctives within those sets of beliefs and what's canonical and what's creedal, to use the big words. There are differences in what we do in worship. There are differences in sacraments. And then how churches run is very different. The Presbyterian Church is quite different from almost everything else we just named. Anybody grew up in a Congregationalist church? No, they're pretty rare these days unless you're in New England. That's really the only polity that's pretty similar to how the Presbyterian Church works within Protestant denominations. And then, as I said, Lucy and I are just going to be up here doing our best for a whole week of Q&A. Okay, how does that sound? Good? If there's something I've missed already, just shoot me an email. We still have time to work it out. All right, a quick caveat. Oh, before I get to that, a quick caveat. I know, I didn't make it. I have various gifts for ministry. Slides are not my gift for ministry. So I apologize in advance that these are pretty rudimentary slides, and I know they have too much text on them. So I'm just sorry. Know that. Once we get to Lucy's week and she gets in there with Canva, I'm sure it'll be beautiful. But y'all just suffer through with me. We're going to carry on here. Okay, this is probably too small to read. Yep, okay. Well, I would say come closer, but I'll just take you through it. This is a sort of, I loved it when I found this. This is a sort of flow chart of Protestant denominations dating back to 33 CE. So I'm going to use CE, Common Era. We date essentially back to the birth of Christ as we think about dates in time as we know them right now. You see there, the big blue box on the left says the early Christian church. And then we're going to scoot over, and the green bubble says the Roman Catholic Church. Here, I'm going to go up here. You guys can see this? So here's the Catholic Church. And then you can see that everything else proceeds in some way from these two bodies, right? Which is fairly remarkable as we think about the various permutations of Christianity today. Good morning. And we're going to get through this, but I just wanted y'all to see the huge varieties of ways the same good news has filtered through the world and has led to the creation of all different branches of Christian denominations. These are not even all of them, and these are not specific congregations, right? These are groups of congregations. We trace to Protestantism here, more on that in a minute. Then we trace down here to the Reformed tradition, more on that in a minute. And then we come over here to Presbyterianism, and then we come over here to the Church of Scotland, and then eventually the Church of Scotland came to the United States and became Presbyterian, and then it became a whole bunch of different kinds of Presbyterian. So in addition to our one little bubble over here, all these other folks are practicing a faith that also began with Jesus Christ. Can you guys see that? I'll make these slides available if you want to see them. So interestingly, some of the churches with which we are in communion, which means we sort of agree that we agree, more on that later, look like they're far apart from us. So the Methodists are way up there in the corner, for example. The Episcopalians are here. We get down here into the Anabaptist tradition and the Baptist traditions. But you can see a little bit at a glance how the flow happened as different bodies split and redefined themselves, either on doctrinal grounds, what we believe, or on organizational grounds, how we work, or often on cultural grounds, what position we're taking as a group on X, Y, or Z issue, right? A good bit of that was driving some of these changes. You can also see that the amount of time that's passed from here to here, this is 33, this is 15, 17, but then we're only getting into now, right? So we've covered a lot of ground in a shorter amount of time, while our longer history did not represent as much splintering or as much change for a good minute. Terry, you have a question?
Okay, on the chart was the Catholics and I forgot what the square is, but those two, there's the Jewish tradition had a lot to do with the establishment of Christianity, and I don't see that represented in this.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. Could y'all hear okay? So Terry said, where is the Jewish tradition? So the Jewish tradition, quick answer, is before this chart begins, right? So let's keep going. I'm going to come back to that in 1 second, Terry. We can think about this as concentric circles, right? So if we think about the huge body of Christians, what's the one thing we're all sure we have in common? Christ. We believe in Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior. There you go. That's an ordination vow for everybody. Then within that concentric circle, there's a body of people who trace their history to the Protestant Reformation. More on that in a second. We call those Protestants. Within that are people who are in the Reformed tradition. More on that. And then we could think of ourselves as kind of a small circle in the center. The Presbyterians are one of those traditions within the Reformed Protestant Christian groups. All right, so when was the birthday of the church as we think about the church? What did you say? Pentecost, exactly. I gave you a hint by putting up a painting of Pentecost. I meant to click that after I'd asked the question, to tell you the truth. So what's happening there? Who knows the story of Pentecost? Just real quick. You all do. I know you can't wait.
The disciples were able to speak in lots of different languages to communicate with people about the good news of
Yes,
Christ.
yes. I heard Holy Spirit over here. That's exactly the Holy Spirit, by some divine mystery, moved in and through people who were not able to speak certain languages and then suddenly were. And they were not just talking about any old thing. They were suddenly able to talk about the good news. They were suddenly able to talk about Jesus Christ, who had been with them, right? This is very early days, right after Jesus' ministry in the world. The fifth graders are on a scavenger hunt. And they have to go around and find stuff and take pictures. Maybe they'll come back. I hope they do. So this is one of who knows how many portrayals of Pentecost. The text in Acts for the first day, which we use as sort of the birthday of the church, talks about tongues of fire, tongues as of fire. So this, when it's portrayed in art, this really mysterious moment of the work of the Holy Spirit usually is portrayed with things that look like flames above people's heads. Sometimes they look like goldfish hanging from the sky. But that's the Pentecost. I got to use my clicker better. When was the Christian church born? Pentecost. Okay. At that point, we'll call that the very early part of the first century CE. Were there any denominations? No, right? Nobody had had a chance to splinter and group up at that point. We're talking about in real time, people who have known Jesus, heard Jesus, have been listening to the teachings of Jesus, and they're deciding, man, is this something that I'm going to be able to do? Am I going to be part of a different community with the backdrop of the Roman Empire? So this was not a situation where they were fighting over things like per capita and ownership of the parking lot. And who's allowed to be ordained? Not yet. They weren't fighting over any of that yet. The first century Christian churches were actually Jews. These were Jews who had followed Jesus or had been changed. Hi, how can we help? Fantastic. I know, rock on. We hope you win. We hope other people win too. Some of the people who were part of the earliest church actually were with Jesus physically, right? This is the origin story we're talking about. Others started to hear the good news. If we read the Gospels, as Jesus was doing ministry, I mean, what was he usually doing? How did he spend his time? This is not a trick question. Preaching. Who said that? Preaching. Thank you, Shirley. What else? Eating. Yes. That's a great answer. He approached people and invited them to table, right? The centrality of table as a sacrament is not an accident or a coincidence. Jesus sat down and ate with people. What else? Healing, performing miracles. Yes, what else? Praying, yes. He modeled a close relationship with God. Any others? Say it again. Yes, radically loving. Thank you for that answer. He was paying attention to who was powerless, who was sick, who was poor, who was ostracized physically, right? In ancient communities, people who were unwell or unloved or who'd gotten in trouble were removed from the community physically. They were like put outside the town or outside the gates or whatever. And he was seeing those people and saying, oh, actually, you matter. And I want to spend time with you. Welcome, right? He was welcoming people. And the big one that nobody has said is he was teaching, right? He went around and specifically taught people a different way from the cultural and political order of the day. And this was dangerous, right? It was not popular. It was not something that he got support from the government. He was a threat to the government. And so the early first Christians really had a choice to make. These were Jews who were hearing a new way, and they were putting themselves at certain risk to decide to affiliate, if you will, to become part of this new thing that didn't even have a name at that point. So to answer your question, Terry, yes, our entire historic backdrop is the Jewish community of which Jesus was a part, right? Jesus was a Jewish carpenter. So Jesus wouldn't have called these like orthodox beliefs or doctrines, right? There was no doctrine of the Trinity, right? That didn't exist yet. That's actually how people over time have come to talk about some of the realities and teachings that Jesus offered while he was on earth. But they came together over time, like anything does. If I go and tell you about an article I read and we start talking about its subject matter, and then you send it to somebody and say, oh, I had an interesting conversation about this, and I read this article about it, and they say, oh, I'm going to hear a speech about this on Thursday. You want to come? In 3 people, we have created a much bigger conversation about an idea, and we've added to it with something written. And we've added to it with something oral as a lesson. And Christianity spread the same way. It's sort of amazing to think about now how we get so entrenched in certain things. But at its start, it was a series of lessons and conversations and gatherings that spread fairly organically, first through the Middle East and then to other parts of the world. Now, I want to say, from the beginning, there was controversy, right? Even while Jesus was alive, there was controversy. If we read a good bit of the New Testament, all over the place, there's stuff people are questioning him about, challenging him about, telling him he's wrong, right? As soon as we get to the time after Jesus' death, when people are starting to group into groups, we would think of them something like house churches now, smaller gatherings that met in people's homes, often in secret because this was not sanctioned by the Roman government. Those groups struggled, right? The entire body of letters from Paul, and some of them have disputed authorship, the letters from other apostles, they are all about people trying to live in community and getting it wrong. From the beginning, people fought, they competed, they listened to other people's voices, they bickered over money, they all wanted status, right? This is sort of how humans have been for a really long time. So while we didn't have denominations and labels around us back at that point, we did already have controversy. And this is part of why the New Testament is still totally relevant for us today. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's all sort of one-to-one correlative. It was written in a very specific context, through very specific cultural lenses, all by men, right? So there are things that we have to think through to understand them from our cultural perspective. But the letters to churches are letters to this church, letters to the church down the street. There's an immediate connection for us. So the Christian church actually was actively persecuted by the Roman Empire for about 300 years. Again, this is high level, pretty warp speed. So do I have any history majors in here? I know I have art history. Yeah? Okay, great. Yeah, you guys let me know if there's something that's deeply missing. But we're going to stay up high to cover as much as we can. But if you remember back to European history, some of this is going to come back to you quickly, I think. I have a teenager who's doing that now, and it's super fun. Who's this guy? 300 years-ish of persecution by the Roman Emperor. Constantine. Looks like a hail fellow well met. The Emperor Constantine. Anyone know what Constantine did that matters for us? That does matter for us, but that's not where I was going. Yep. Yes, so Constantine, in 313, I know, too much text for slides, noted. In 313, he issued the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity and most other religions legal. This was a very big deal. If you have been part of a persecuted faith, you weren't allowed to get together. You weren't allowed to worship. You weren't allowed to talk to each other. You weren't allowed to know who else believed what you believed. And suddenly, not only are you allowed, but you're official, right? That is a head spinner right there, a very big change. And Constantine had some interesting and complicated motives for that. And then he called in 325 the Council of Nicaea, which is one of the first places where we get formalized doctrine, where a group of people got together to define what we believe and to say, this is right and this is wrong. This is where we start to see orthodoxy coming into being, not the faith tradition, but the meaning what is correct. And we still, to this day, use the Nicene Creed, a statement of belief that came out of that council way back in 325. We use it sometimes in worship. It is not as inclusive as some of our other affirmations of faith, so I don't use it as much as others. But if you read it, you would recognize that it has a Trinitarian formula. So that means it talks about God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. Then in 380, so you see how much time is passing there. It's a long time for a single life, but a short time for the length of history. This is a new Emperor Theodosius. He calls a council, which makes the Nicene version of Christianity. So the set of beliefs defined at the Council of Nicaea into the official definition of Christianity and makes it the official religion of the Roman Empire. So if you're a Christian, how does that feel? Good? Yeah? I mean, you're not going to get arrested and flogged for going to worship. But what if you're a different group? You're getting flogged. Exactly. So while this is a moment that, if we were sort of triumphalistic Christians, we'd be like, yeah, we won, right? We won after Thessalonica. Then we have to remember that means that other groups actually were no longer allowed to practice faith. Other groups became persecuted. And while it is helpful that, particularly since we still use the Nicene Creed, it is helpful that the Council of Nicaea helped define what we believe and give us some concrete understandings. That also became a barrier. That became an exclusionary line. So those practitioners of Christianity that did not agree with what was decided at the Council of Nicaea, they're suddenly the ones who are on the outside. So each of these big moments, actually, they mean that some people have power and other people do not have power. We can still see that happening today, right?
I think we had a question over here. Did you have a question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Elizabeth, yeah. Yep, 313.
I was just noticing that he made Christianity and most other religions. So he opened it up to everybody to make it. And then not until later did they start narrowing the...
That's exactly right. So Elizabeth is just observing so helpfully that while in 313 there was a somewhat expansive opening to the Christian practice that actually got narrower. What is that? 3 generations later, we've suddenly narrowed again as Orthodox belief has been defined and has become a boundary line. That's exactly right. And some of our European historians they will take your questions after this about what that meant. So we can start to see, again, this is high level coverage, but we start to see the gap grow between loosely groups of churches that are affiliated with the eastern part of Europe and Greek-speaking countries, and the western part of Europe where Latin was still used, particularly as the language of faith. And often those gaps, that widening, diverting from each other, tracks both theologically and, as y'all would guess, politically. So very little of church history lives in a vacuum, if any. I mean, I'd be hard-pressed to find a moment that says church history is distinct from whatever was happening around it. It is deeply cultural, deeply rooted in its own moment in time. And as much as people say they don't want politics in church, Jesus was a fairly political guy. So no matter what, these moments that we're going through quickly, where the church was defining or redefining itself, uniting, splitting, whatever, they have as their backdrop a cultural moment, including whatever political thing was happening at the time. Roughly, the Western European tradition becomes the Catholic Church and stays under the authority of Rome. The eastern part of the church and some of Asia becomes the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, I'm using Orthodox there, meaning the particular line of faith, not little o, lowercase o Orthodox, which means sort of right thinking. Y'all know what I'm saying? Yep. All right, I'm going to keep going. So the Roman Catholic Church obviously had enormous power of every kind, right? Was deeply entrenched in politics, held religious authority. There was almost no separation of the two in Western Europe until about the Renaissance. And then in the 15th century, things start to get a little bit exciting. I don't know that they were exciting as you were living through them. But one of the big moments that changed things for Christian practice was in 1440 when the printing press was invented. And for the first time, there was, I don't know how wide truly, but there was more access to printed material, which sounds wild now that we're trying to print no material anymore. But people had access to information. I mean, if we think about how it was, I was telling someone the other day about the first research project I did in college using the internet. And we think about what that was in college for me. 1997, my first internet research project at college was about how the shooters at Columbine had used the internet to plan that shooting. How about that? That was my freshman year in college. Anyway, we think about the printing press somewhat as the internet became a huge opening of information for people. And suddenly, if you were never going to a library to look something up, but you were curious about it, you looked it up, right? You went and found that out, and we still do it to this day. Think about that as the closest analogy to the printing press. Suddenly, there was access to information, including the Bible. This was not a season where everybody had a Bible at home or under their chair, certainly not on their phone. Every kid didn't get a Bible in the 5th grade. People didn't have the Bible. How did you hear the Bible until this point? At church. And how at church? Did you follow along? Nope. Somebody read it to you. And guess what language they were using to read it to you? Latin. So you're sitting out there pinching yourself to stay awake while someone reads you something in Latin and you're supposed to follow along. So for people to be able to read for themselves was a huge change in culture, including in the influence of Christianity. So as you would think, people then started to ask questions. And this wasn't the first moment, I'm being a little bit glib, but having access to information in our world usually generates discourse and questions, and people started to question what was going on in the Roman Catholic Church. Nick? Oh, that's a great question, but I'm going to put it in the next one when we do translations, if that's okay. We'll go all the way back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, Nick. It'll be so fun. The Dead Sea Scrolls are fascinating. We'll go on a field trip. So, oh, wait, I don't want to do that yet. What were the things people started to question about the Roman Catholic Church? Power, yes. Who had power? The Pope, yep. Who else? Priests. Clergy and Pope were seen as distinctive, apart, special. They were understood to have special access to God and were allowed to communicate with God, to read text, even to observe sacraments, where laity were not. What else? How to get forgiveness. What did they call that? You remember? The sale of indulgences. Yuck. Yeah, so the Roman Catholic Church had a practice for a very long time where if you really wanted to be forgiven, you paid some money and asked to be forgiven. And it actually funded the Roman Catholic Church and some priests who got a really nice referral fee on the side for selling indulgences. What else? The nature of the Eucharist. Yes, thank you, Tom. Who's allowed to participate? What do we believe is happening in the Eucharistic moment? Laity were not served communion, right? And then as a next step, people were allowed, just regular people, were allowed to partake of the bread, but not the cup. Who has access? What else? What'd you say? Papal infallibility. That's not on my list, but yes. Yes. Is the Pope God? We would say no. But in 1440, a whole lot of people said yes, right? The Pope is of divine substance. So the sale of indulgences, these are just a few. The sale of indulgences, lay participation in worship, prayer, Eucharist. Are you allowed to talk to God? Are you all allowed to talk to God? Yeah, come on, friends. Yes. Yes, and I hope you do talk to God all the time. But that was not actually the way people thought of their relationship with God, even as recently as the 15th century. They thought they had to go through a mediary, right? A priest or clergy person. Sacraments. There were many sacraments being observed in the Catholic Church, and a shift for us was to go only to 2, and then the role of the clergy. So, in 1517, sorry, these are squunched, Lacey. Cut and paste into slides doesn't do them a whole lot of justice. On the left there, another handsome fellow is our friend Martin Luther. That was a portrait painted of him, so we actually think that is probably what he looked like. He doesn't look super happy about things, but he was excommunicated. On the right is one of many, many artistic portrayals of the moment, and there's a little bit of lore around this moment, when Martin Luther, who was a clergy person in the Catholic Church, nailed a list of theses, 95 things that he wanted to protest about the practices of the Roman Catholic Church. He nailed them to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany. Now, in our minds, in my mind, I'll just take it for myself, that feels awesome and dramatic. Like Martin Luther's like, take that. The church is going to get fixed, right? It was probably not actually that dramatic at all. First of all, there probably was not a crowd. This is sort of the reality TV version that people have gathered to see this. This was more like a public comment notice. So now, let's say your next door neighbor is going to clear cut all their trees, just for instance. There's a public comment. Some people know what I'm talking about. There's a public comment opportunity, right? And there's a little sign put up in the yard or in the neighborhood email for us that says, hey, public comment about these things, or open discussion, town hall, right? This was something more like that. These were disputations that were intended to create discourse. But Martin Luther, in his study of the practices of the Roman Catholic Church, of which he was a clergy person, right? He's coming from the inside. He had grown so concerned about whether these acts were faithful and were actually building people's relationships to God that he felt moved to say something, moved to challenge them. So in 1517, he did just that. And that's sort of the marker we use as the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, which is the next big branch of our, we're going to run out of time. All right, so Luther wanted to protest and change the church. You see those words built in: Protestant, protest, Reformation, reform. He wasn't trying to burn it down. He wasn't trying to start something new. He wanted to fix it, right? But he got excommunicated. That was not well received. Our theology, the Reformed version of theology, traces back to that moment. It spreads through Europe. Again, people are still learning, but now there are print materials to support. The 1530s, John Calvin, who's one of the theologians and thinkers we think of as the origin of the Presbyterian Church, he started to refine some of this thinking, wrote extensively about the nature of God and human relationship with God. John Knox, another of our sort of ancestors in faith, he was a Scotsman, studied with Calvin, took these ideas back to Scotland. England is a complicated story because Henry VIII is in the mix and he needed a new wife. So faith got a little bit commingled there with him. William Tyndale was a studier of the Protestant Reformed thinkers. He got to know Thomas Cranmer, who was Henry VIII's fixer, so to speak. And out of that whole mix comes the Church of England, which is partly Protestant Reformation and partly pure politics, which is fascinating. A whole other class on that. We trace our roots back to Scotland and England. All right, I'm going super fast, I know, but we have to go get our kids and go do worship in just a minute. So there are actually a lot of Presbyterian denominations. The PCUSA is just one of them. And our shared governance includes a structure that's loosely based on democracy, right? We do not have a bishop. Did y'all know that? Good. We do not have a bishop. Our leaders, whether it's ordained lay people or ordained clergy, are all taking the same vows. We're making the same promises as we agree to serve. In our congregation, as in all Presbyterian congregations, pastors do not direct the work. We facilitate the work, but who directs the work? Who's in charge of governing our congregation? Elders. Yeah, elders together are called the session, exactly. So the word elder comes from a Greek word, presbyteros. That's telling me, go do worship. And that actually is both of our names. So clergy people are called teaching elders. Lay people are called ruling elders. This whole set of ideas comes to the United States in 1683 with Reverend Francis McKeamy. He comes from Ireland. The first presbytery in our country was started in Philadelphia in 1706. That's pretty old. That's before the country was a country. There were Presbyterians already forming committees in 1706. God love them. 1725, William Tennant founds a college that's Presbyterian. Eventually, it becomes Princeton. Back then, it was called the College of New Jersey. We have roots in, this is sort of to some of our conversation about how we worship. This may surprise you, but some Presbyterian clergy were instrumental in the Great Awakening and some of the sort of tent and revival ways of worshiping that inspired a lot of people to faith in the early 18th century. And then this may be a name you know, or some of you may be related to him. Please let me know. John Witherspoon was a Presbyterian minister. He was president of Princeton. He was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, the only clergy person to sign the Declaration of Independence. And he convened the first General Assembly, which is still the organizing meeting we have in our denomination today. The first one was in 1789. Now, within that history comes our denomination, the Presbyterian Church, USA. So there are others, right? There are groups of Presbyterians, and over time we have split and come back together multiple times. And some of the splits have resulted in other denominations. Some have been for a time, and then we have come in this sort of reunited body. The biggest was in 1861. The Presbyterian Church split largely over the issue of slavery and whether it was biblically justified or biblically prohibited. And maybe this is sort of predictable, but the Southern Church and the Northern Church were the lines for that split. They took on different names, which are confusingly similar. The Presbyterian Church in the United States was different from the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. One was Northern, one was Southern, and they stayed apart for a long time until 1983, which is very recent. 1983, the Northern and Southern churches reunited. A new confession was written in that same year. It's called A Brief Statement of Faith. Joanna Adams was on the committee that wrote that creed, and she's going to do a class about it in January. We are now the largest Presbyterian denomination in our country, which is, not as big as other denominations, but of the Presbyterians, we're the biggest. Quick stats. As of 2022, in our country, there are just over 1.1 million active adult members. That includes confirmed youth. It does not include baptized children who are not technically church members. There are about 300,000 of those. 8,700 congregations. They're largely small. The mean size is 131 members. 65% of congregations in our denomination have 100 members or fewer. Does that shock you? Yeah. This is something for us to be thinking about as we live into wherever God's calling us to go. We have about 1,675 members.